Please welcome me, Gerald Flichum. Thank you, Michael, and it's a real honor for me to be here tonight to speak to you folks. And I'm also a member of the Roundtable too. So, kind of get into the Guerilla War. It's kind of a pet project of mine, and it started when I attended the North Georgia Civil War show up in Dalton and heard Keith Bohannon, who teaches history at West Georgia, talk about this. And I took about 8 to 10 pages of notes. And went home and just, I don't know, just a fire lit up and the light bulb turned on, and I started researching this project, which was like a 5-year project. And then in 2017 at KSU, I had the opportunity to pitch my course to the program director there, and she bought it. So I've taught this about 5 times. So the lecture tonight is kind of based on the course. It's kind of an abbreviated outline of the Guerilla War in Georgia. And, you know, when we think about the Guerilla War, we think about Missouri. We think about the vast happenings in Kansas, Missouri that was going on prior to the Civil War. So very few of us knew about Georgia and how the Guerilla War impacted, especially North Georgia. So when we think about it, and actually guerrilla war is probably not the proper term. It technically would be called irregular war, but guerrilla sounds better. So I kind of stick with guerrilla war, because everybody knows guerrilla war. We think of Missouri, we think of various things associated with that, but Georgia had its own internal war, which was actually a guerrilla war. Because it was an internal war, civilian against civilian, military, home guards, the whole gamut. So, looking at this first slide, we kind of rethink the guerrilla war in Georgia as almost a separate civil war. Can everyone hear me? I'm not in front of the microphone. I know you guys in class can hear me.
Gerald, you can remove it. No, you can pull it. Okay.
I'll drop it.
You want this one?
Give me that wireless from here. Thanks. So when we think about the guerrilla war in Georgia, we think that the guerrilla story in Georgia is not so glorious as the big picture. Kennesaw, the Battle of Atlanta, Sherman's March, that sort of thing. So, but the thing about the guerrilla war in Georgia, it's much more personal and much closer to home than the mainstream war. And that was my whole focus in developing handbook and the course, is to show people what the real story was. Also, the only monuments we have of guerrillas are tombstones. That's it. Because that's all you're going to see. You're going to see gravestones of the results of the guerrilla war in Georgia, throughout Georgia. I do a lot of field research. I'm in a lot of cemeteries, and it's unbelievable some of the stories I've been able to piece together for my course. To stand in a country cemetery and stand at the tombstone of someone who was killed by the home guards and the guerrillas in 1864, and stand there at their grave and do a little video and present it to the class and tell the class and tell people about their story. So a lot of that is presented in the book that I have, that I developed as a handbook for the course, the Guerilla War in Georgia. So we'll see if we can. There we go. Right button. Mark, can we slide that up just a tad? Just a little bit to catch the bottom counties.
Let's see. How's that? You let me know, because I can't see it.
Well, we don't know those counties down at the bottom. That's hardly at all anyway. But this is a modern map of Georgia, showing 159 counties as a modern map of Georgia. And what I did is I highlighted on the Georgia map the areas that I covered and I researched about guerrilla activity. And as you notice up there, the large cluster is mostly North Georgia, Northwest Georgia, Northeast Georgia, and then it's scattered until you come down to South Georgia you'll see another cluster. So this is just the research I've done. And believe me, there's no way in my lifetime I could hit 159 counties and research all the goings on. Because the information, you really have to dig the information for this. So this just kind of gives you an idea of the activity, the guerrilla activity that was taking place in 1863, 1864 into the end of the war. Now, we all know about this guy, okay? Mainstream guerrilla, outlaw Josie Wales, okay? It was generally thought that the irregular war, the guerrilla war, had little impact on the major war. And the post-war information on guerrillas and their activity was isolated to the biographies of famous partisans, guerrillas, or outlaws. The outlaw Josie Wales. The guy that wrote this was from Alabama, North Alabama. The character that he bases on, it's been surmised, was a man by the name of John Pemberton Gatewood, a red-headed beast from Georgia, who was actually from Tennessee. He rode with Champ Ferguson, and his story is very much like this character that Clint Eastwood portrayed in the movie The Outlaw Josie Wales. And that movie portrayed what the guerrilla war is. One of the first movies, not the last, one of the first really good movies that portrayed what the guerrilla war was like, even though it was centered in Missouri, Arkansas, and out west.
Damn it.
Slide that up just a tad. You want another magazine?
Yeah, let's give that a try.
Let's try this. Go on.
Yeah, that's way too high.
Well, wait a minute. Go back down.
Here you go. You just put it on the wall. There you go. I did that in class once. I said, you need to pull the screen down because I was projecting on the whiteboard in one of the classes. So this picture here, this is a photograph taken from Georgia 136 out of Jasper, heading north. And it's taken of, pictures taken of Sharp Top Mountain, which is looking south toward Kennesaw, in the fuzzy areas, Kennesaw and Sharp Top. And this is traditionally unique of the terrain in North Georgia. And each region, I must say, each region of Georgia with this unique terrain had different impacts of the irregular war in Georgia because of the diversity of the terrain in the state of Georgia. Now, we all know what North Georgia looks like. So the terrain features of Georgia varied as much as the participants in the guerrilla war, because as each region varied, the people that live in that region are different. Okay? And that's one thing I discovered, not being a native Georgian, being a transplant here in Georgia. I didn't get to take Georgia history. And there are things about Georgia history. I said, wow, you're telling me that people who live in Okefenokee are strange? They certainly are. They're a lot different than they are these people that live in Gilbert County. I can tell you, they speak different. They're different. And the state of Georgia is like that. Now, we live in the 21st century, and many of us are transplants into Georgia from other areas. But I just wanted to show this kind of impact of the terrain. Now, this is what probably a good photograph I found of North Georgia, what the terrain is like in North Georgia and the Appalachians, above Atlanta, above Cherokee County. Actually, this is a photograph that was taken by a professional photographer. And this is actually Logan's Turnpike. This is the remnants of Logan's Turnpike, which was a main road from Gainesville to Blairsville in 1864. That's the turnpike right there. Kind of looks like the Appalachian Trail. Here, I'll give you that back. I'm banging stuff. I'm just going to talk about it. That was an actual main route until they built a road in the 20s that circumvented Logan's Turnpike. And
I've got to get it reconned.
that it just shows the rugged terrain. It looks kind of like the Appalachian Trail.
Use your mic so the people at Zoom can hear you.
Gerald, you can unhook it.
Yeah, you can unhook it. Just pull it out.
I promise I won't start singing. You don't want to hear me sing. How's that?
Better.
Better? Much better? Yeah, I'll probably go hoarse, but it's fine. So what's noticed about this terrain is it's very rugged. In North Georgia, the mountainous terrain, there were very few railroads. In 1864, very few railroads in North Georgia. There were very few improved roads. There were no large towns. You had Delonica, you had Gainesville, you had Athens, but they weren't large cities like Macon, Columbus, and Savannah, Atlanta, of course. It was a very fertile ground for bands of men roaming around the area to hide out. This was a really easy home for deserters, draft evaders, Unionists that were evading the draft, home guards and state cavalry roamed in this area. So this is just a photograph I wanted to use to depict North Georgia mountains. The next photograph is showing the Pine Barrens of Georgia. Anybody know this region here, the Pine Barrens? It's kind of like central Georgia, or central Georgia, South Georgia. I look at that photograph and I can just feel the ticks and the jiggers crawling right now. Buddy, I tell you, that's a tick ranch right there. You see the sandy soil, you see the scrubby trees and stuff. It was an area that was had scattered plantations, very isolated farms during the Civil War, and it became a breeding ground for dissension in the state of Georgia. This area bred what was known as the peace movement by the latter part of 1864 in this Pine Barrens region of Georgia. Some of the towns started having meetings. They wanted Georgia to opt out of the war. And it was called the peace movement. It wasn't in Atlanta, it wasn't in Savannah. It was this Pine Barrens area and some of the smaller counties down here. As the war progressed, this region witnessed a lot of political discontent with the Georgia state government. And the home guards were extremely active in suppressing that dissension in the local citizens of those counties. Okay, this is the wiregrass area of Georgia. This reminds me of Fort Stewart, Georgia. That's what Fort Stewart looks like. And also, this is what North Florida looks like, and over into Alabama. Wiregrass. See that spangled grass? You see those small long leaf pines? They have the big pine cones, not like our pines in North Georgia. Very scattered underbrush. It's kind of open. It's called the wiregrass region. It's predominant in South and Southwest Georgia. In the Chattahoochee Valley, from Columbus down into the Apalachicola, was the largest cotton-producing portion of Georgia. Wasn't the coast. That was rice and indigo. It was cotton in this region. Large plantations in that region of the Chattahoochee National Valley. It was the largest cotton-producing area. It served a lot of raids from deserter bands and irregulars, partisans from cross-border areas of Alabama and Florida. There were bands and partisans in North Florida and southeast Alabama that were cross-border into Georgia and raiding this line. Oh, this is my favorite. Inviting, isn't it? Good vacation spot. That's the Okefenokee. Does anybody know how large the Okefenokee swamp is? It's shrinking. 400,000 acres of that.
Good place to put a steel.
Good, yeah. if you could find some solid ground. But can you imagine? Gators, cottonmouths, and stuff. It was said during the war that there were over 1,500 deserters hiding out in the Okefenokee. I say, ain't no way there were 1,500. Sustained maybe 150. First of all, you ain't gonna live in that. You gotta have little sand islands that the Okefenokee has throughout. Also, what are you gonna live on? You can only live so much on gators and snakes. Really. So I estimate there were probably 100 to 150 deserters, outlaws, escaped Union prisoners. There were quite a few escaped Union prisoners, runaway slaves, good hiding spot. Okay? The home guards, when they sent men into this area to round those people up, they disappeared. They found one, I believe it was a conscript officer, they found his head. They never found his body. So the people that lived in this area, they date back to the original Indians, which were disappeared, and people that live on the perimeter of this swamp. They're kind of like the Cajun folks in Alabama, those alligator hunting people, which is evil people. They're different. They live very rugged. They speak a different language than most of the settlers. So these deserters that were hiding out in the swamp, they were raiding the outlying towns in the communities on the perimeter of the swamp. Blackshear, Georgia, was raided 7 times during the Civil War in 1864 and 1864 by men hiding out in there that went into Blackshear to just help themselves with whatever supplies they needed. And then when the locals complained about it, the women that lived in the area, among the traders and the hunters and trappers, they said, if you don't like it, we're going to call the men out in the swamp and visit you. So this is a bad area. Okay. So you see the diversity. That's the reason I did these slides. You kind of see the diversity of what we're dealing here with terrain. North Georgia. Now, in North Georgia specifically, where there was a large majority of the activity, these partisans, these irregulars, and these weren't partisan rangers, okay? They would adopt the title partisan ranger to bring some kind of legitimacy to their operation. Most of the guerrillas were just plain bands of outlaws, okay? In my course and in my research, I found and was able to identify 26 separate bands of men that were operating as irregulars in Georgia. Missouri had 220. Okay, so that's another thing I discovered. I keep going backwards, Michael. We gotta get the clicker turned. So I often talk about in the course. I often talk about the home guards, and we all know pretty much about the home guards, even though there's not a lot written about it. The home guards were not the cream of the crop in Georgia. Okay, I always call them, they were like mounted morons. So all the good men and boys go off to Virginia, the Army of Tennessee, go to war. What's that leave behind? It's like leaving a motorcycle gang in charge of your community if all the men go off to war. Those guys were not the sharpest tacks in the world, and they often mistreated their own people in their community, people they were supposed to protect. The home guard's role was to protect the community and enforce the law while the men were away. For the most part, in the state of Georgia, for the most part, in the whole South, they didn't do that. Frazier wrote Coal Mountain based on a true story in Haywood County, North Carolina. When I had a moment to ask him about it, he said, my father did not want me to write about this because it would have brought dishonor on the family. And I said, where did you get your material on home guards? He said, Haywood County, County History, Unit Histories. Yeah. Same thing in Georgia. Same thing is going on in the state of Georgia. Home guards. General Henry Head, early in the war, he warned about the independent nature of irregulars and partisan rangers. He said they could not easily be controlled because partisans, guerrillas operated under no clear authority or no clear command. He also said men without the proper restraint could impose on civilians as much as regular soldiers. And we know what the impact was when the Union Army came down into Georgia and swept across the state. And that was a really drop in the bucket of what the guerrilla and home guards were doing after Sherman moved on into the Carolinas. Because in December 1864, Georgia was in total chaos. We had a huge debt. The governor had totally lost control of the state. people were starving in northwest Georgia because there was a drought. So, a few things about guerrillas. Guerrilla bands fought localized skirmishes, and they were often motivated by the first issues: plunder, profit, revenge. They deployed tactics of ambush, raiding, hit-and-run attacks with the civilian population in the center of the battlefield. This is typical of North Georgia. South Georgia, things were scattered out much more. So the guerrilla and regular war was more scattered than it was in the north. The regulars were often mounted. They used a wide variety of weapons. They generally did not wear uniforms. Some wore uniforms of the enemy for the purpose of deception. I found many instances in Fannin County, Gilmer County, Pickens County, where these guys would be riding around in Union uniforms or Confederate uniforms, and they were on the other side. Women wrote about it in northwest Georgia, that men would appear at the house at night dressed in Confederate uniforms, and they were actually Union troops, trying to find out if they would divulge who the Unionists were in the area so they could raid them. So, and then when they did wear uniforms, it was just a mixed clothing. These guys would go back and plow the field during the daytime and then round up in their bands of guerrillas and raid at night. They would attack the railroad, the Atlantic and Western Railroad from Chattanooga to Atlanta was a big target with the irregulars. We even had bands coming from Pickens County that were cutting the railroads and telegraph lines from Cartersville down into Ackworth in 1864.
You need to go forward? Oops. All right.
This is my favorite sketch here. This is an illustration done by a famous artist by the name of Howard. Dr. Trying to think of over at Wallace State sent me this photograph. Howard was a children's book illustrator. He's famous for painting pictures of pirates. If you've seen the paintings of pirates walking the plank, maroon pirates and stuff, Howard illustrated children's books, but this illustration is, I think it's at the bottom of the illustration. I don't think we can see it over this, but it's something entitled, "They Were Talking to Me While I Was Sitting on My Horse."
Oops, sorry about that, Gerald.
Anyway, that kind of shows the illustration. I thought this is a perfect illustration to demonstrate guerrillas in their activities. Yeah. Guerrillas were real big in apprehending whoever they were after or whoever crossed their paths in the operations. And John Pemberton Gatewood, he was a psychopath, psychotic killer. If you just happen to come upon him, if you feel like killing that day, he'd kill you. That's it. He was responsible for killing 110 people personally. So, and he went to Texas after the war disappeared, like most of the girls in North Georgia. They all went to Texas because they knew if they stayed at home, there was going to be some revenge and retribution, which was very big in North Georgia after the war. I covered that in the book, covered that in detail in the course too. So
Click somewhere on the screen, I think this clip. There you go.
okay. So by the end of 1863, the distinction between armed deserters, Unionist guerrillas, Tories, there's an archaic term from the American Revolution, Tories. Another is bushwhacker. Does that ring a bell? Bushwhacker? That's an archaic term that was used extensively during the American Revolution, that was used in Georgia during the Civil War. A Tory was someone with Unionist sentiments. They were also categorized if you were disloyal, you weren't a believer in the cause, you were labeled a Tory. You didn't have to be a Unionist or anti-secessionist or whatever, abolitionist or whatever. You were labeled a Tory. So, and outlaw bands. The lines between those groups was not very clear by 1863 in Georgia. There were active bands of irregulars on both sides of the state line with North Carolina and Tennessee. One of the most famous was a man by the name of Goldman Bison from Tennessee. And he would come down into Georgia. He raided into Worthington, into Fannin County. They ran him out of Fannin County. The state troops did, state cavalry. And they pursued him into North Carolina, and men of Thomas's Cherokee Legion chased him 26 miles and killed him in 1863. But he was a notorious Union partisan leader out of Tennessee. And that's just one that raided in. There were others out of North Carolina that raided in that are very obscure. The Ray brothers, many others. That they're just a footnote in history. Very little is known about these guys and these bands. By late 1864, December specifically, the war in Georgia had reached a new level of abuse. Georgia was in bad shape. There was an internal civil war in the state of Georgia by late 1864. Sherman was gone. He was in South Carolina. He was burned in Columbia by this time. He was gone. He was out of the state by the end of December. There was a new level that had been reached of abuse and extreme actions as the home guards and the guerrilla bands amplified their conflict in the mountains specifically. By 1864, they really went after it in northwest Georgia, Walker County, Catoosa County, Fannin, Pickens, Gilmer. Each side reacted to the other side's depredations, and the scale and intensity of violence increased from the destruction of property, robbery, vigilantism, and summary execution. That was real big. There were a lot of prisoners being taken by these sides in this area of the war. There's a couple of illustrations from Frank Leslie's News and Professor Robert Davis, State College of Alabama, showing some of the activities. This illustrates some of the activity that's been posted in the newspapers up north about guerrilla irregular activities. And as you can see, they're burning houses and they're shooting people. Civilians didn't matter. Women were hung by home guards, children were killed by home guards, and then the veterans would come home and find out about it, and they would go on a home guard.
What was their motivation?
They were just mean. They were just mean and so evil.
What were they getting at?
Plunder and loot at the most, robbing the farms, robbing the people. There was, Joe Brown had managed to rustle up about $4,000 in gold to send to northwest Georgia because the people were starving to buy food. And they were going to end up buying food from the Union Army in Cleveland, Tennessee. And Jack Colquitt's band, who were mainly deserters from the 11th Texas, they robbed the judge and took the money and distributed it among themselves. So the people up there in northwest Georgia got nothing. So the motivation was just, there was no motivation. It means evil. In northwest Georgia in particular, by late 1864 and 1865, the civilians were struggling in North Georgia specifically to maintain some level of livelihood. But they found that they were immersed in an internal struggle where the functions of society had broken down and completely collapsed. There were no trials, there were no judges, there were no schools, there were very few churches. And the few churches that were brave enough to hold service were often guerrillas would ride into the church, discharge their firearms. In Pines Creek Baptist Church, home guards, the irregular band killed John Richards, a pastor, in September 1864 for preaching against the war. Home guards were told him, "You better stop this, or you're going to get killed." And that's what they did, they killed him. And that's, an isolated story. You're not going to read this stuff in history books. You might ask, why don't we read about this stuff? I want to see this history. Well, I was told by some of the old timers in North Georgia that you don't read about this because it was so bad, this activity was so bad, people just wanted to forget about it at the end of the war. And it wasn't until the 1930s when they started writing county histories that some of this stuff kind of started coming out. Now, the women in Georgia were writing about this in their diaries, in their letters about this activity. So those letters and those county histories are what brought some of this to the forefront. And then in the 1970s with Vietnam War, which was a guerrilla war, then the academics at college started paying attention to this information, and they started researching, and books started being written. Today, now we have movies, a lot of books that are coming out. It's not just the James gang, Jesse James, Frank James. They wrote the Contra. It's a lot of famous outlaws were guerrillas in the war. Law and order ceased to exist beyond those who had the most military power at a specific time and place. The economic system in Georgia was eroded, and what was once a thriving agricultural economy turned into almost a pure subsistence one, especially in northwest Georgia. Every family feared for their homes, their livestock, their crops, and their lives. Local factions became polarized as civilians turned to approaching Union forces for assistance and subsistence. Hardened Southerners viewed the disloyal as traitors and Tories and took revenge. This last slide here is from the official records, 1865, General Order Number 90, and is talking about the punishment of guerrillas. By command of Lieutenant General Grant, E.D. Townsend, his assistant adjutant general. And it, as you can see, I'll read it. As the forces of the enemy east of the Mississippi, having been duly surrendered for their proper commanding officers to the armies of the United States, under agreements of parole and disbandment, and there being no authorized troops of the enemy east of the Mississippi River, it is ordered that from and after the first day of June, 1865, any and all persons found in arms against the United States or who may commit acts of hostility against it east of the Mississippi River will be regarded as guerrillas and punished by death. The strict enforcement and execution of this order is especially enjoined upon the commanding officer of the United States, blah, blah, blah. So, the last surrender east of the Mississippi occurred in Kingston, Georgia, May 12, 1865, with General William Wolford and General Judah Benjamin.
No, Henry Judah.
Henry Judah, okay, in Kingston. And that's when guerrillas came in. And the guys that had deserted and been hiding out came in and got their paroles and surrendered to avoid this. The ones that didn't surrender went to Texas or Arkansas or Indian Territory, and for the most part became outlaws. And they started all that nonsense out in Texas and out west after the war. A lot of those guys were guerrillas back in the east. A lot of them came from Georgia. So this basically kind of an overview of the course I teach, the Guerilla War in Georgia, which is 8 lessons, 8 classes. I've taught it 5 times. I continue to research in Georgia, specifically things that happen in Georgia. I don't know when I'll teach the class again. I hope to teach it at least once a year. We just finished it. We finished in April. Guerilla War in Georgia. That's some of my students here in the cheering section. So, but it is my favorite, and I told Keith Bohannon when I ran into Keith a couple of years ago up at the World Trade Center, I told him, I made a copy of my book. I said, it's your fault, Keith. It's just your fault. So, and he's one of the few that teaching that really knows a lot about this stuff. So, I'm open to questions if anyone has any questions. Yes, sir.
We will document any incidences in Clark County. I see you haven't done any
Okay.
research.
I haven't found much. I found some footnotes and mention of guerrillas in Cobb County, in Soundtown Road area, but I have not found anything else specific. So, but I would sure like to find something out. So I know there were some incidents down on Collier Road where some irregulars under Robert Graham attacked the Union wagon train down Collier Road, rated. So, no, I haven't, but I'm still out there looking.
All right, quick question, the meeting called out was one of the first movies I saw on the home guard explicitly. Would you say that was fairly accurate, or would you say it was sensationalized? Or what are your thoughts on it? Not the book, but the movie.
Yeah, it was Hollywooded up. It was sensationalized, of course. But there was a lot of elements when it dealt with the home guards. That was pretty factual. Those incidents happened. The boys were killed. Their heads, well, actually, a couple of instances I read, their heads were put on the post, the fence. And they knew it was straight across. Yes, sir.
The men who went to Texas and Arkansas, would they be guerrillas who fought on both sides?
For the most part, they would be Southern guerrillas or just outlaws. Because there were Union deserters that joined some of the guerrilla bands. Colquitt's band consisted of Union deserters and Confederate soldiers. So probably a few, but for the most part, they were going to be more the Southern guerrillas in Tennessee. And, I don't know if y'all remember, they hung Champ Ferguson. They court-martialed him and hung him in Nashville. He was supposedly a guerrilla captain at the mission. He wasn't the only one. They hung Marcellus Clark. They called him Sue Monday. They hung him. He was a guerrilla captain. They certainly hung a bunch of Missouri during and after the war. Yes, sir.
Are there any marked graves in Georgia as to that person's real activity?
No, there's not. It's either going to be a regular tombstone or a Confederate soldier's tombstone. I found a lot of Confederate soldiers or a Union soldier's tombstone. And I must mention there was also another archaic term that was used. It took me a while to figure this one out, but the term hogback. I kept reading the term hogback. What is a hogback? I've never heard of that. Well, a hogback technically is a Southern soldier, a soldier from Georgia who deserts and joins the Union side. And that is a derogatory term for hogback. Now, I found a hogback buried in the cemetery at Carmel Baptist Church right across from my subdivision. And he indeed served on both sides, and he's buried there with a Union shield on his tombstone. And 5 of his church members of that church have the Confederate cross. So that hogback went to church with his Confederate buddies after the war. And I found it right there on Highway 92 at Carmel Baptist Church.
Hey, Gerald. We've got a question online here.
Yeah.
Is any estimation of casualties in Georgia during the war due to irregular force action?
No, we don't. We have no specific casualties because the events were so scattered and so isolated and so irregular. So there's no, we're just talking about a few here and there. There was no, these were skirmishes at the most. They were not battles like were occurring in most of the South.
How about the subscription officers during the movie Coal Mountain? Were they as bad as they were portrayed?
They weren't big guys for the most part. They weren't your friend. They were, Georgia was divided into districts, and they had in these districts, when they came up with the Conscription Act in 1862, there were 3 phases, and they went initially from 18 to 36, and they bumped it up. And then later in September 1864, I think it went from 17 to 55. So it wasn't very popular. It wasn't popular with Governor Brown. He was at odds with Jefferson Davis over conscripting and taking Georgia troops, especially into Virginia, where they were being slaughtered for the most part in the battles in Virginia. So conscription officers weren't that popular. They were backed up by the Home Guards, which made them less popular. So another good movie is Ride with the Devil. It's a good guerrilla movie. It does portray the guerrilla war in Missouri. So.
Okay, we got one online. It says, any specifics on the Walden Branch massacre above McCaysville?
The Madden Branch?
Yeah.
Madden Branch?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell about that, and then I'll end up. That happened. That was our good old friend, the redheaded beast from Georgia, John Rivers and Gatewood. There were some young men under a Fannin County resident by the name of Peter Harris, And he had been recruiting for the 5th Tennessee Mounted Infantry, which was a large unit that was consisted largely of North Georgians. In Tennessee, it was a Union regiment. And he was recruiting, he had recruited 12 young men in Fannin County, and they were moving up into Tennessee, and they were at McCaysville, right across the border. They crossed into the border, and they came upon a group of mounted men in Union uniforms, and they fled up into the hills, and they said, no, we're Union, we're your guys on your side. And they were conned into giving up their little weapons they had, shotguns and pistols. And it was John Pemberton Gatewood and his guerrilla man, dressed in Union uniforms. So Gatewood interrogates them, he takes some papers off of them, some recruiting papers they had, one of the members had, I think Peter Paris had, showing that he was recruiting from the 5th Tennessee. And he lined the boys up on the road, and he went down the line and shot each one of them in the face. And Peter Paris and one of the other young men bolted and ran off, and I think Peter Paris was shot 6 times and survived. The other young man was shot and died in the river and survived. And they found, a farmer and his son found the bodies in the road the next day. By the way, that incident got to the papers, got into the official records, got into the Union reports about those boys being killed by Gatewood. And after that happened in 1864, Sherman put a price on Gatewood's head, which they were not able to collect. Is there any other questions?
Yeah. Anybody online?
So this is just an overview. The class is much more detailed. And I've tried to get the university to install seat belts in the classroom so we don't crawl under our seats and all this bad stuff that I have to teach. But it is kind of a pet project, and I really enjoy it. Thank you so much.